It was broad daylight when Muhammad Ali walked into one of the most dangerous palaces on earth. No cheering crowd, no boxing ring, no gloves. No rhythm of fists on canvas, no referee, no bell to save him if things went wrong. Just marble floors stretching endlessly beneath his feet. Just armed guards lining the walls, silent, expressionless, fingers resting near their weapons. And just one man at the center of it all, a man the world feared. Across the room stood Saddam Hussein. This was not a fight Ali could win with speed, not with power, not with courage alone. Ali's hands were trembling. Not the kind of shaking that comes from fear of pain, but the kind that comes when you fully understand the consequences of failure. Because this wasn't about him. This wasn't about pride. This wasn't about legacy. This wasn't even about politics. This was about lives. American hostages, ordinary people, were being held thousands of miles from home. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, people who had no power, no protection, no voice. Governments had tried, diplomats had spoken, warnings had been issued, nothing worked. So now, one man stood there instead, unarmed, unprotected, uncertain. Ali knew one wrong sentence could end the conversation. One careless word could turn respect into rage. One misstep could mean prison or worse. This wasn't a boxing match where confidence intimidates an opponent. This was a room where confidence could be mistaken for disrespect. And respect, here, meant survival. As Ali waited, the silence pressed down on him, not the silence of peace, but the silence of power watching closely. Every step he had taken to reach this room led to this moment. Every belief he had ever spoken about justice, dignity, and humanity now stood on trial. There would be no second chance, no rematch, no redemption if he failed. And yet, he stayed, because walking away would have been safer, but staying might save lives. And when Ali finally spoke, the world would soon learn something unforgettable. Sometimes the bravest fights don't involve fists at all. Have you ever walked into a place knowing one wrong word could cost lives? Sunlight poured through the tall palace windows in Baghdad. It illuminated marble floors polished to perfection, gold-trimmed walls, portraits of power staring down from above. Soldiers stood motionless along the corridors, rifles held close, eyes forward. No whispers, no footsteps out of rhythm. The air wasn't loud, but it was heavy, the kind of silence that exists only where authority is absolute. Muhammad Ali walked slowly, guided by guards who said nothing. Every step echoed. He wasn't there as a boxer, not as the greatest, not as a champion celebrated in arenas across the world. That version of Ali had been left at the door. Here, titles meant nothing. He wasn't there for applause. He wasn't there for cameras, and he wasn't there to negotiate power. He was there as a messenger. Earlier that year, tensions between the United States and Iraq had tightened like a vise. War loomed. Threats traveled faster than reason. And caught in the middle were American civilians, ordinary people, engineers, workers, families, detained as political leverage. They weren't soldiers. They weren't decision makers. They were names on lists, faces behind locked doors. Governments had tried to intervene. Formal channels were opened. Statements were issued. Warnings were exchanged. Nothing moved. Diplomats spoke carefully, too carefully. Because in moments like this, words are dangerous. One wrong phrase can harden a stance instead of softening it. So when official effort stalled, something unusual happened. A man with no political office was asked to step in. Not because he held power, but because he held moral weight. Ali came without an army, without leverage, without guarantees. He came alone. No threats, no demands, no promises he couldn't keep, just the belief that respect, spoken sincerely, might reach where force had failed. That's what made this moment so fragile. This palace wasn't a place for emotion. It was a place for dominance. And Ali knew that the same words that inspired millions could be misinterpreted here as arrogance, as interference, as disrespect. Yet he walked forward anyway. Because sometimes history doesn't change through strength. It doesn't shift through pressure. And it doesn't bend through fear. Sometimes, history changes because one person is willing to stand in daylight, in silence, and speak with moral courage, even when the cost of being wrong is unthinkable. And that was the world Ali had just stepped into. As Muhammad Ali was escorted through the palace halls, something unusual happened. His confidence began to fade. Not because he lacked courage, but because this wasn't a fight he could win with speed or strength. There was no footwork that could save him here. No combination of punches. No knockout blow. This was a different kind of arena. The corridors seemed endless, lined with guards who never spoke and never looked away. Their boots struck the floor in perfect rhythm, echoing through the marble halls. Ali noticed everything. The distance between exits, The way conversations stopped as he passed. The way doors closed behind him, quietly, permanently. Each step forward meant fewer options to turn back. The man waiting at the end of the hall wasn't an opponent who followed rules. There would be no referee, no mercy bell, no promise of fairness. Saddam Hussein was unpredictable, powerful, unforgiving. He was a man whose decisions altered borders and erased lives. One careless sentence could be interpreted as an insult. One misplaced tone could be taken as defiance. One honest truth, spoken the wrong way, could end the meeting instantly. Or worse. Ali knew this. Later he would admit something few expected to hear from a man known for fearless bravado. His hands were shaking, not from fear of being hurt, but from fear of failing. Because this time, failure didn't mean losing a title. It meant people staying behind locked doors. Families not going home. Lives remaining trapped in a political storm they never chose. Ali paused near the entrance to the meeting chamber. The guard stopped. For a brief moment, the hallway fell silent, as if the building itself was holding its breath. This was the point of no return. He could still leave, still say the timing wasn't right, still let diplomats continue their careful, distant conversations. But walking away would be easier. And easier had never been Ali's path. The doors began to open. Slowly, deliberately. Light spilled into the room, revealing polished floors and a long, empty space between two sides of power. Ali stepped forward. Then he saw him. Saddam Hussein entered from the opposite side, surrounded by quiet authority. No rush, no hesitation. The room froze, guards stiffened, eyes lowered. Even the air seemed to settle. This was the moment Ali had imagined 100 times, and still hadn't prepared for. He wasn't facing a man who needed to prove himself. He was facing a man who already believed he controlled the outcome. Ali stood still, no fists clenched, no posture of dominance. Just a man unarmed, about to speak words that could change lives, or end the conversation forever. And in that suspended moment, before a single sentence was spoken, one question hovered over everything. Would you walk into the office of the most feared man alive, unarmed? Muhammad Ali could have played it safe. He could have chosen every word carefully. He could have spoken in rehearsed phrases. He could have stayed neutral, balanced between sides, saying nothing that might provoke, nothing that might risk offense. That was the sensible option. That was the diplomatic option. And in that room, diplomacy often meant survival. But Ali knew something deeper. Neutral words don't move hardened power. Careful language rarely opens locked doors. And that wasn't who he was. He had built his life on speaking when silence was easier, on standing firm when stepping back would have been safer, on believing that truth, spoken with respect, carried its own kind of force. Ali lifted his eyes and met Saddam Hussein's gaze, not defiantly, not submissively, directly. He didn't speak as an American representing a government. He didn't speak as a Muslim appealing to shared faith, and he didn't speak as a boxer known for bravado and flair. He spoke as a human being. His voice was calm, measured, unshaken by the silence pressing in around him. He spoke about families, about mothers waiting for sons to come home, about children who didn't understand politics but felt its consequences every day, about the invisible weight carried by people whose lives were paused by decisions made far above them. He didn't accuse, he didn't demand. He reminded. He spoke about history, not as something written by winners, but as something remembered by generations. How leaders aren't measured only by power. How strength fades, but choices remain. How mercy echoes longer than fear. This wasn't negotiation. There were no terms on the table, no leverage, no threats disguised as polite language. This was an appeal. Ali understood the risk in that. Appeals require vulnerability. They invite judgment. They place trust in the listener's humanity, and humanity is unpredictable. For a moment, Ali felt the weight of the room again. He knew how easily his words could be dismissed as narv, how quickly sincerity could be mistaken for weakness, how dangerous it was to rely on conscience in a place built on control. Silence followed his words. Not interruption, not rejection, just silence. Ali stayed still. He didn't fill the space with more explanations, didn't rush to justify himself, didn't retreat into safer language. Because courage, he believed, wasn't about volume. It wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about winning. True courage was standing by what needed to be said, even when silence felt safer, even when retreat felt logical, even when the cost of being misunderstood was enormous. In that moment, Ali wasn't thinking about reputation or legacy. He was thinking about faces he would never see, people whose freedom depended on words spoken carefully, but honestly in this room. And as he waited, Knowing he had crossed the line from safety into truth, Ali understood something clearly. This was the most dangerous kind of bravery. Not the kind that throws punches, but the kind that trusts humanity in the presence of absolute power. True courage isn't loud, it's speaking truth when silence feels safer. Saddam Hussein listened without interrupting. No reaction, no expression, no visible sign of approval or offense. His face remained unreadable, the kind of stillness that made silence feel heavier than words. The guards didn't move. Their posture never changed. Their grip on their weapons stayed firm. Time seemed to stretch. In that room, seconds didn't pass normally. They lingered. Ali felt the weight of every breath he took. Every pause felt deliberate, even dangerous. Most people would have stopped there, would have waited, would have let silence do the work. But Muhammad Ali understood something crucial. Silence can be permission to ignore. So he pushed further. Not aggressively, not emotionally, carefully. He didn't demand the release of hostages. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten consequences. Because threats close doors, and accusations harden pride. Instead, Ali stayed honest. He spoke about how wars are remembered, not in the moment but years later. Not by headlines but by families. Not by power but by loss. He didn't say the word, war, loudly. He let it sit quietly between them. His message wasn't spoken as a challenge. It was implied that this moment, this decision would outlive both men in the room. That strength fades when regimes fall, but mercy survives in memory. Ali wasn't telling Saddam Hussein what to do. He was asking him who he wanted to be remembered as. The risk in that question was enormous, because leaders surrounded by absolute control rarely appreciate being reminded of legacy. Legacy suggests an ending, and endings threaten power. Ali could feel the tension rising, not outwardly but inwardly, like pressure building under the surface. The room felt frozen in time. No one shifted their weight. No one cleared their throat. Even the air felt still. Ali knew this was the most dangerous part of the meeting. Not the walk through the palace, not the introduction, this moment, because now the message was clear, and clarity leaves no room to hide. One wrong reaction, a flicker of anger, a tightening of the jaw, a glance toward the guards, and the meeting would be over. Ali watched closely. He didn't stare. He didn't look away. He stayed present. This wasn't bravery fueled by adrenaline. This was restraint fueled by purpose. Inside, Ali felt the pull to soften his words, to step back, to return to safer ground. But he resisted. Because the people he was there for didn't have the luxury of caution. They were already paying the price of delay. Ali let the final thought settle without repeating it. That this war, this standoff, would not be remembered for strength. It would be remembered for mercy, or the absence of it. He stopped speaking, and waited. In that pause, everything hung in balance. Power, pride, lives. This was the edge where courage either changes history, or disappears into silence. And Ali stood there, unarmed, unwavering, knowing that whatever came next would define far more than the outcome of this meeting. It would define what kind of power truly mattered. Because sometimes, escalation doesn't come from raising your voice. Sometimes it comes from refusing to take your truth back, even when the cost of saying it feels unbearable. Then something unexpected happened. Not suddenly, not dramatically, not in a way anyone in that room could have predicted. Saddam Hussein softened. It wasn't visible in his posture. His voice didn't change. There was no emotional display, no shift in authority. But the atmosphere changed. The silence no longer felt threatening. It felt contemplative. For the first time since the meeting began, time started moving again. Saddam leaned back slightly, as if considering something beyond the walls of the room. Not the immediate standoff. Not the political advantage. Something further ahead. This was not the reaction Ali had prepared for. There was no anger, no dismissal, no command to end the meeting. Instead, there was pause. And in that pause, the weight of Ali's words began to settle. Because Ali hadn't challenged power. He hadn't insulted it. He hadn't tried to overpower it. He had spoken to it, quietly, respectfully, human to human. Saddam didn't respond right away. The guards remained still. No one spoke, no one moved. Then, without ceremony, the decision was made. The hostages would be released. No speech, no declaration, no attempt to turn the moment into spectacle. Just a choice delivered calmly in broad daylight. For a second, Ali didn't react. Not because he didn't understand, but because he needed to be certain he had heard correctly. This was it. The moment everything hinged on. Years later, people would imagine shouting, celebration, tears. But there was none of that. Because this wasn't a victory claimed loudly. It was a victory granted quietly. Muhammad Ali felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not pride, responsibility lifting. He had carried the weight of lives into that room, and now, they were no longer trapped behind decisions made in silence. Ali didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't press further. He understood something important. When power chooses mercy, the worst thing you can do is demand credit for it. So he simply acknowledged the decision. With respect, with restraint. And in that restraint, the moment held its dignity. Outside the palace, the world would soon react with disbelief. Governments had tried sanctions, threats, negotiations layered with pressure. Yet one man, unarmed, unofficial, unprotected, had achieved what institutions could not. Not by force, but by courage delivered calmly. The guards remained in place, the palace remained silent, but the future had shifted. Lives would be returned, families reunited, fear eased, if only temporarily. As Ali prepared to leave, he understood something with absolute clarity. This was the most powerful moment of his life. Not because he had dominated anyone, not because he had won, but because he had been heard. History often celebrates loud victories, explosive moments, public triumphs, but real turning points rarely announce themselves. They happen quietly, in rooms without cameras, in decisions made without applause. And this was one of them. Ali walked out of that palace the same man he had been when he entered. But the world he stepped back into was different. Because that day proved something unforgettable. Power does not always respond to pressure. It does not always yield to fear. Sometimes, when courage speaks calmly, and truth is offered without threat, power listens. Power listens when courage speaks calmly. The hostages were freed, not immediately celebrated, not paraded before cameras, but quietly one by one. People who had lived under uncertainty were finally allowed to go home. Families were reunited. Mothers held children they feared they might never see again. Husbands and wives embraced without knowing how to put relief into words. And around the world, people reacted with disbelief, because this wasn't how these stories were supposed to end. There had been no military strike, no ultimatum, no show of force. Just a decision, made behind closed doors, after a conversation most believed would never change anything. Muhammad Ali walked out of that palace the same way he had walked in. No raised fists, no victory pose, no declaration to the press. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had carried something heavy, and finally set it down. But while Ali left unchanged in appearance, history did not, because something rare had happened. A global crisis had shifted not through fear, but through principle. Not through dominance, but through dignity. There were no punches thrown that day, no belts won, no titles defended. And yet, many believe this may have been the greatest victory of Ali's life. Not because it added to his legend as a fighter, but because it revealed something deeper about who he was when the cameras weren't flashing. Ali had always been known for his courage in the ring, for standing up to opponents twice his size, for refusing to back down when the world demanded silence. But this moment required a different kind of bravery. The bravery to walk into danger without protection. The bravery to speak without knowing how words would be received. The bravery to trust that humanity still existed, inside a system built on control. This wasn't a story about changing a dictator. It was a story about refusing to abandon people when the situation felt hopeless. Ali didn't claim credit. He didn't frame the outcome as a personal triumph. He understood that when lives are at stake, ego has no place, and that restraint, more than anything, defined the moment. History often remembers leaders for their power, for the wars they fought, for the enemies they defeated. But time has a way of shifting the lens. Years pass, flags change, statues fall. And what remains are the moments that prove something about human choice. This was one of those moments. Because it showed that strength doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with noise or force. Sometimes, strength looks like walking into a room where you have no advantage, and choosing principle anyway. Sometimes, it looks like risking your own safety for people you'll never meet. And sometimes, it looks like believing that even the most powerful figures in the world are still capable of listening, if approached with respect rather than threat. That day, Muhammad Ali didn't fight an enemy. He faced power, and he did it with principle. That's why this story endures. Not as a political footnote, not as a celebrity anecdote, but as a reminder. A reminder that real bravery isn't loud, it doesn't seek applause, and it rarely gets immediate recognition. Real bravery shows up when it's dangerous, when the outcome is uncertain, when walking away would be easier, and that's what Ali did. He walked in when others stepped back. He spoke when silence felt safer, and because of that, lives were changed forever. The strongest people don't just fight enemies. They face power, with principle. If you believe real bravery is standing for others when it's dangerous, type ALI in the comments. And tell me, would you have had the courage to walk into that room?